Every child learns that Rome destroyed Carthage, that the city was burned, its people sold into slavery, its name turned into a warning. But almost nobody asks the question that really matters. How did a landlocked farmer republic, constantly on the edge of bankruptcy, defeat one of the richest trading powers in the ancient world? How did a city of merchants, ship owners, and silver mines lose the money war to a city of small landowners and stubborn peasants? On paper, Carthage should have crushed Rome. Carthage controlled the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean. Its harbors were packed with merchant ships, moving grain, wine, textiles, metals, and slaves. Its elites invested in trade networks stretching from North Africa to Spain and beyond. It had access to the rich silver mines of Iberia, minting gleaming coins that lubricated its entire system. It didn't rely on farmers grabbing their spears. It hired professional soldiers from across 3 continents, Numidian cavalry from North Africa, Iberian infantry from Spain, Greek mercenaries for specialist roles. It looked like a modern, sophisticated commercial empire. Rome looked backward by comparison. A land power, a patchwork of farms, villages, and small towns spreading slowly across the Italian peninsula. Its wealth wasn't concentrated in trading houses or overseas colonies, but buried in fields of grain and vines, in herds of livestock, in the labor of citizen families. Its armies were not hired professionals, but citizens temporarily turned into soldiers, men who had to return home sooner or later to plant, harvest, and tend their land. Its treasury was often close to empty, its tax system basic, its coinage relatively limited. So why did the commercial superpower lose to the agrarian republic? Why did Carthage, with all its money, ships, and mercenaries, end up wiped off the map, while Rome used that victory as the launchpad for an empire? Carthage didn't just lose a military contest, it lost a financial contest it didn't understand it was in. Rome grasped something Carthage never truly internalized. In a long war, the side with a more resilient financial system wins, not the one with the biggest treasure chest. It's not about who starts richer. It's about who can keep going when the costs become insane, when logic says stop, and when every rational calculation says cut your losses. To see that, you have to wind the clock back to the beginning, before Hannibal, before Cannae, before the final burning of Carthage, back to a time when these 2 powers first collided over a volcanic island in the middle of the Mediterranean, Sicily. At the start of the First Punic War, Carthage was the established power. Think of them as the incumbent empire of the western Mediterranean. Their wealth came from commerce, harbor dues, colonial tribute, and control of key ports. Carthaginian elites were investors more than warriors. Their world revolved around profit, shipping routes, and trade agreements. For them, war was an instrument, a dangerous, expensive instrument, but ultimately another tool to protect commercial interests. Rome, on the other hand, stumbled into that war as a regional land power. It had alliances across Italy, but very little naval experience. Its economy was based on land, not trade. Roman elites were warriors and landlords, not ship magnates. If Carthage was a boardroom, Rome was a hard, stubborn farming community with a senate attached. Carthage's model was simple. Gold pays for war. If you need an army, you hire one. If you need ships, you pay for crews. If you want security, you rent it. Rome's model was very different. Citizens pay for war first with their bodies, then with their money. The state doesn't start with a massive war chest. It starts with people willing to suffer, and it turns that willingness into credit. When the First Punic War broke out over Sicily, neither side expected it to last 23 years. But that's what happened. A generation-long struggle that turned into a stress test of 2 financial systems. At the beginning, Carthage had every advantage at sea. Their fleets were experienced, their sailors trained since childhood on the waves. Rome could barely build a ship, let alone sail one well, but Rome made a decision that, on paper, looked insane. It decided to construct a fleet to match Carthage, not a token fleet, a massive one, hundreds of warships built in a rush at staggering cost. Where did the money come from? Rome did not have Carthage's trade empire or Carthage's silver, but it had something Carthage lacked, a political culture capable of mobilizing private wealth for public survival. Roman elites often financed shipbuilding themselves, expecting reimbursement later through taxation, indemnities, and plunder. They treated the war as an investment in the Republic's survival and in their own long-term power. The Republic, in turn, effectively wrote them an immense civilization-scale IOU. This is the first place you see the difference. Carthaginian rulers treated war as a budget line. Rome treated war as an emergency that justified bending the entire financial system around it. Carthage asked, "Can we afford this?" Rome asked, "Can we afford to exist if we don't do this?" The First Punic War became a war of attrition, not just in men and ships, but in money. Rome lost fleets, not once but multiple times. Storms wrecked entire squadrons. Battles at sea left expensive hulls burning or sinking. Each time, the logical economic move would have been to cut losses, negotiate, and accept limited influence. Rome did the opposite. It built again and again. Private citizens advanced funds. The state squeezed allies. The Republic took on more and more invisible debt. Debts of money, but also debts of blood and land, owed to those who sacrificed. Carthage, guided by merchant logic, tried to be cautious. Wars that devoured cash for decades threatened to destabilize trade. So they relied heavily on mercenaries and avoided mobilizing their own citizens in large numbers. Their goal was to win on favorable terms while keeping domestic disruption manageable. They wanted to preserve the engine of their wealth, commerce. Over 23 years, Rome's finances looked worse and worse on any balance sheet. But that balance sheet didn't capture the whole truth, because Rome's real asset wasn't silver or ships. It was a deeply ingrained idea that the Republic's survival trumped individual comfort. Citizens could be ruined, farms destroyed, taxes raised, and yet the system still held together. Rome could demand more. Carthage, tied to a narrower oligarchy and afraid of internal instability, kept trying to limit the pain. In the end, that caution was more expensive than risk. Carthage lost the war. It had to surrender Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, and accept Rome's foothold across the sea. That indemnity did more than drain a treasury. It strangled Carthage's flexibility. Rome, now with its first overseas province, gained new revenue streams to service its own debts. Carthage, meanwhile, had to send ship after ship loaded with silver to its former enemy. The moment the First Punic War ended, Carthage made a fatal financial decision. To save money, they tried to underpay the mercenaries who had fought for them. Unpaid armies are the most dangerous creditors in the world. They don't send polite letters, they march. The resulting mercenary war nearly obliterated Carthage from within. Cities rebelled. Armies that had once fought under the Carthaginian banner turned their weapons against it. It took years and immense cost to crush this internal crisis. That episode was not just a political disaster, it was a verdict on Carthage's financial model. Carthage's military power depended on a continuous flow of cash. When that cash stopped, its rented security didn't just vanish, it flipped. A state that relies too heavily on money to buy force always lives with that risk. When you treat war as a contract, battlefield loyalty lasts only as long as the payments do. Rome had its own internal tensions, crushing debts on small farmers, class conflict, arguments over land distribution, but its army was not a hired foreign force. Roman soldiers fought as citizens. Their loyalty was tied to land, family, honor, and a sense of belonging to the Republic. When the state struggled to pay, it faced unrest and political turmoil, but the legions didn't usually switch sides because a single payment failed. Their identity was not something you could cancel, like a contract. Then, as if to test both systems again under even worse conditions, came the Second Punic War and Hannibal. If genius alone could win wars, Carthage would have rewritten history. Hannibal's campaign is one of the most audacious in the ancient world. Marching an army, including war elephants, over the Alps into Italy was a logistical and financial nightmare. He annihilated Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimena, and Cannae. At Cannae, especially, he inflicted one of Rome's worst defeats, killing or capturing tens of thousands of Roman soldiers in a single day. For a moment, it looked as though Rome's whole system might finally crack. But behind the brilliance of his maneuvers was the same old weakness. Hannibal needed sustained support from Carthage, reinforcements, money, supplies. He needed the state to go all in financially and politically. Instead, he hesitated. Carthaginian politics were dominated by an oligarchy suspicious of the Barcid family, wary of spending too much, and terrified of overtaxing their own elites and trade networks. They sent help, but not at the scale or with the urgency that a long invasion of Italy required. Rome responded to disaster by ripping open every financial safety valve it had. Coinage was debased, silver content was reduced to stretch metal further. Temples were stripped of precious offerings. Allies were forced to contribute men and money. New legions were raised from allies, and even from the poor, who were promised rewards in land and status later. The state took on obligations it had no clear immediate way to meet, betting everything on one assumption, that if Rome survived, it could make good later by plundering conquered territories and taxing a larger empire. This is where you see the stark difference in mindset. Carthage kept asking, how do we protect our existing wealth while fighting this war? Rome asked, what is the use of wealth if Rome falls? Carthage tried to conserve the body and risk the limbs. Rome risked the entire body because it refused to accept death. Over time, that difference compounded. Rome's allies in Italy suffered invasions, devastation, and heavy losses, but most of them did not defect to Hannibal. They calculated that their futures were still better tied to a surviving Rome than to Carthage. Rome's network of alliances, its extension of partial citizenship, its integration of Italian elites into the Roman system, these were not just political strategies. They were financial ones. They created a broad base of taxpayers and soldiers whose fates were bound to Roman success. Carthage's network looked similar on a map, subject cities, colonies, dependencies, but it lacked that integration. Many of its subjects were more afraid of Carthaginian power than loyal to it. When the balance of power shifted, their commitment wavered. Tribute depends on fear. Shared citizenship creates a more stable kind of revenue. As the war dragged on, Rome shifted strategies. Instead of chasing Hannibal endlessly, it pressured Carthaginian possessions elsewhere. It went after Spain, cutting Carthage off from its silver. It built up naval power again, harassing Carthaginian supply lines. Finally, under Scipio Africanus, Rome carried the war directly to North Africa, forcing Carthage into a final showdown on its own doorstep. By the time Carthage faced Scipio at Zama, the financial war was already largely decided. Rome had access to the resources of much of Italy and parts of Spain, an alliance network that still worked, and a political class willing to carry heavy debts into the future. Carthage had a narrower oligarchy trying to protect its own fortunes, and a citizen body that had never been fully mobilized in the Roman sense. When Carthage lost that war, the terms were brutal. Indemnities, loss of territory, military restrictions. Economically, Carthage survived, but as a shadow. Its independent financial capacity was suffocated. It became a client power, watched carefully, allowed to trade, but not to truly arm. For a while, Carthage recovered commercially. The city was too well placed, too skilled in trade, not to rebound. Its harbors filled again, its merchants prospered. On paper, the money returned, but strategically, it was living on borrowed time. Its financial system had been subordinated to Rome's. Rome had the power to decide when enough was enough. The final act, the Third Punic War, is often told as a story of Roman paranoia and overkill. A rising Rome, eager to remove a potential rival forever, invents a pretext and destroys a city that was no longer a serious threat. But underneath that political story is a financial reality. By then, Rome's war machine was funded by revenue from an expanding empire. Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa. Its tax base, its loot, its slave labor, all of it gave the Republic a capacity for violence that Carthage could never match. Rome could afford to spend 3 years besieging a single city. Carthage could no longer afford to resist that kind of sustained pressure. So why did Carthage lose the money war to Rome? Not because its people were lazy or its generals incompetent. Not because it was doomed by geography or some vague idea of fate. Carthage lost because it built a financial system optimized for profit in normal times, while Rome, almost accidentally at first, built a financial system that could survive abnormal times. Carthage relied on contracts, cash flow, and mercenary loyalty. Rome relied on citizen sacrifice, allied integration, and the ability to turn suffering into long-term credit. Carthage thought it could always pay its way out of danger. When that assumption failed, when it couldn't pay the mercenaries, when it couldn't outspend Rome indefinitely, when its silver was cut off, its system buckled, Rome accepted that it could not always pay. It accepted bankrupt citizens, devastated lands, and temporary financial chaos in exchange for survival. It was willing to look ruined on paper because it knew that if it won, the future would belong to it. In the end, Carthage was richer in many ways. Richer in trade, richer in commerce, richer in per capita wealth. Rome was richer in something else. Endurance. The willingness to absorb punishment, to mortgage the future, and to demand sacrifices no merchant board would ever approve. That grim, stubborn resilience turned out to be the more powerful form of capital. When you look at powers today, states, giants, corporations, it's easy to be dazzled by the Carthaginian side of the ledger. Trade flows, GDP, market cap, glittering cities. But the real question is the Roman one. When stress comes, when wars drag on, when crises stretch into decades, whose system can keep going longest? Whose people will still believe in the story, even when they're paying for it with their own lives and savings? Sometimes the loser is the one who looks richer right up until the end. And sometimes the winner is the one whose books look terrible, whose debts look unsustainable, but whose underlying structure is built to survive fire. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.